There are some people already seated, and I don't think we ought to disappoint them. I think there are a few bags of potato chips left. You can just grab it and take it to your seats.
Charlie Rose, and here's Charlie. This is Ilan Troen, who's going to be the moderator. We thought we'd do something a little different this year, have a little bit of a conversation rather than an academic lecture about some of the key issues facing Israel. And I'll let Ilan introduce his panelists.
Well, first of all, I'm not Charlie Rose. A rose, as you know, only blooms in June, and this is still May.
Not around here.
Not around here lately.
No?
No.
I'm from the far north, someplace north of the Hudson River, that far north. Since you don't know who I am, and you now know that I'm not a rose by any name, my name is Ilan Troen. I teach at Brandeis University. A center that has a name that will surprise most of you. It's the Schuster Center for Israel Studies. And yes, I don't know what to do. I can put this under my tongue, if that'll help. Okay. Put this up here. A second. I can't button my shirt. I'm Israeli. What's more, the top two buttons are never buttoned in a proper Israeli shirt. It's like Quakers always have to have buckles in their shoes. These are uniforms that become inbred, so that I may be from north of the Hudson, but my real home is in Beersheba, or outside Beersheba, in a place called Omer, and most of my career has been at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and I'm here doing my reserve duty in the very quiet, pleasant, uncontentious campuses that Mitch Bard described. I don't think that I ought to read the bios. They're in the brochures you have, except to say is that since this is being recorded for when Rose is not in television, this will someday appear on NPR, that maybe I ought to say just a word. To my immediate left is Jerry Steinberg, who's probably Professor Dr. Gerald Steinberg of Bar-Ilan University, who cut his teeth on politics at the University of California at Berkeley, probably in happier days, is well known as an expert in a number of areas. First of all, in Israeli politics and polling and elections. He's also someone who's engaged in two-track, or how many tracks there are, behind-the-scenes diplomacy with Palestinians. He's worked with international organizations. But he's more currently known in the last decade as a consequence of his experience at Durban, in an occasion in which NGOs from many places in the world ganged up on the state of Israel, and that led him to found a very important organization called NGO Monitor, where he observes, evaluates, assesses, and disseminates information on NGOs. That's the Professor Gerald Steinberg that many of you may know from public appearances, as well as many blogs and articles. Next to him is, without doubt, the most interesting member of this group, is Professor Nurit. That is the full name. Nurit Novistoich, who was at Berkeley, and who I'm told yesterday gave a fascinating representation of what is actually taking place at Berkeley today. Her real home is also in Israel. She's a graduate of the Hebrew University in psychology, and she is based at Bar-Ilan, if I'm not mistaken, today. No? Hebrew University.
Hebrew University moving to Haifa.
And moving to Haifa. Well, if you move to Haifa from the Hebrew University, you have to pass by Bar-Ilan. I'm not entirely wrong. And it's quite unusual, and I think there's a real advantage for all of us, is that these kinds of panels and conferences usually have historians, people from literature, cultural studies, media, political science, international relations, economics, strategic studies, but we're really very lucky to have somebody whose profession is psychology. And she has used her psychology to plumb issues that have to do with Israeli identity. And among the communities that she's investigated in depth are the Haredi Jews, as well as she has something to say, to observe about the way in which the Holocaust is perceived in Israeli society. And so there's much fresh that I expect that we will be hearing this afternoon. The final speaker is Professor Fred Lazen. I wouldn't say Freddie, because I'll get into trouble. Professor Fred Lazen, who I know ever since we both made Aliyah to Ben Gurion University, and we've been colleagues there for many years. Fred is a political scientist as well, who has dabbled in some very creative history, and he studies both American Jewry as well as Israel and its politics. Among his diverse works are works on Israeli internal politics, on development towns, and the politics of development towns. He's written on the Holocaust and how it's been perceived and its politics in American life. And perhaps he's best known to many audiences for his work on Soviet Jewry and the struggle for Soviet Jewry and how it was been carried out in the United States. But being a political scientist practicing in Israel, he also has much to say about Israel in the international arena. Although on that issue, we're going to call upon him less than his other skills as an observer and an interpreter of Israeli life. And indeed, that's the point of this session. I take very seriously the two words that have been put into the title, and as they've been framed by Laura Cutler and by Mitch Bard, it says an afternoon roundtable discussion. Well, you have to imagine the rest of the shape of the table, somewhat of a round table. But it goes on to say, fateful issues in Israeli politics and society. And by that I mean what you're going to have here today is a group of Israelis who are going to talk about Israel as if they were in Israel. And the point of the perspective that I think that we ought to try to bring for you today is, in a sense, a reaction to something which is occurring in the American Jewish community. The unspoken word here, I don't think anybody mentioned yet today, was fine art. I said it once, I won't say it again.
No vulgarity.
Dr. Bard talked about the A word, that other one is the B word. But the B word is very important because what he has argued, and there's a very vigorous debate among American Jewish scholars about to what extent is there in fact a distancing among the younger generation of Jews in this country and maybe an older generation of Jews in this country from Israel. And much of this discussion, based upon the perception of people like Mr. B and others, is that Israel is just misbehaving. There was a wonderful question at the end of the last session that had to do with, it's not a question of love it and leaving it. We also love it, and we don't think you ought to leave it. Where precisely is the discussion in Israel? To what extent are Israelis themselves concerned about their own society out of largely a measure of love? And to what extent, what do they see that's wrong? And I would like you, those of you who don't live in Israel, to understand that one can actually love a place and live in it, and that the issue of distancing is an issue which is actually very distant from those of us who actually do live there, who care about it, who are willing to fight for it, who pay taxes, who hope that our children and our grandchildren live there, but who have serious kinds of questions. And the kinds of questions that I'd like to bring to your attention are really the kinds of questions that Israelis ask of themselves And actually, if I would elide or erase the word Israel and put the word America in there, in fact, these are questions that you yourselves very often act about this, what's the word, this imperfect union, this experiment which is still going on, this experiment in democracy. So it's with that measure of sympathy and understanding that I would hope you would bring to the discussion that takes place. And I do have a first question. And the first question I can phrase very, very briefly, very succinctly, and it comes from many different components. It has to do with the issue, is Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, is the democratic aspect of Israeli society actually in danger? And I think there are multiple answers. These are people who have not brought papers to present to you on the topic, and I suspect that we will go around several times on it. But let me begin with, is Israeli democracy in danger? Gerald?
You want to start with me, okay? First of all, thank you. The introduction covered a lot of the very major issues. I'm going to start by just putting a couple of slides on that I think illustrate part of the problem of the debate and why this question is even being asked. I don't think we would have asked this question 5 years ago, perhaps not 2 years ago. And having been one of the people who's often accused in the political warfare that takes place in Israel of being one of those who endangers democracy, I've been called a McCarthyite, fascist, right-wing ultranationalist recently, I think. And I think there are that kind of language, and the way in which the debate is being conducted is part of the problem. There are problems. There are problems in every society, as you mentioned. So what I want to do is take a couple minutes just to talk about the way I perceive challenges. We use the term somebody is hearing challenged. Is Israel democratically challenged? My short answer is no more than the United States or France or other countries that are dealing. Democracy itself is always a challenge. And I'll also list some issues where in the 21st century the problems have become more acute. I just want to start by comparing two very quick slides. This was an ad that appeared in the New York Times about maybe 2 weeks ago. And you'll notice that the word that dominates there is extremism. It was placed in the New York Times by a donor to the New Israel Fund who talks and said that he was very upset about what he saw about the treatment of women in Israel. He had just come back from Tehran. I won't go into the donor's politics, but the language there is one saying extremism. If you say Israel is endangered by extremism, if the women's rights are completely endangered by this image, there's a serious problem. Now I want to show you the way the same New Israel Fund took that ad and ran it in the Israeli media. And there the main word is shutfut, it's cooperation. And yes, we have some issues that you have as a woman who's half black, half white, marching, protesting. That's not a country that's democratically endangered through extremism and intolerance and polarization, particularly right-wing polarization, as that first ad suggested. But this is a country where there is a great deal of protest and freedom of speech and the ability to act in a very wide and very active political arena. I might even say that Israel, some people have said, I wouldn't say this because it's politically incorrect, that Israel is a hyper-democracy. It's been used in the literature. And that's part of the problem. The danger to Israel's democracy is the fact that we are very much, I would say so much democracy, the democratic system, the way it functions, is centrifugal. In other words, it splits off into many different groups. And if I were to find the general debate in Israel and concern, it's the tyranny of the minority. We've had, and things have changed 2 weeks ago. I don't think the Mashiach has come, so I think this is a temporary change. But when you have a system, a parliamentary system, where you have a government that had how many different factions and parties were in the last government? 5, 6, 7, and including a 3-person party that split off from a 7-person party. The system becomes very unwieldy. And any prime minister, or particularly a prime minister which is similar to a president of the United States, that is politically conservative in a lowercase c, and fearful of losing his or her majority and being brought down and being forced into elections and perhaps losing that position, is going to be very, very careful not to alienate anybody in that coalition. And that veto of the small minority groups has created all the issues that we will at least touch on, and many more. The fact, for instance, that a significant part of the population does not share in the responsibility of protecting the country. That's a major problem. And it's because that small group in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community essentially had a veto because they could pull out of the government. And there are many other issues like that. Dealing with illegal settlements and outposts where there is an agreement of a number of Israeli governments, right and left, but there's certainly a fear of violence and tremendous clashes and instability and loss of support of a small number of members of the coalition in doing that, and that makes the government, prime minister, defense minister, pull back. The last point, or 2 points that I want to make in this broad opening overview, is that the polls, and I'm always cautious about polls, but if you look at polls, public opinion polls, and election returns, and they pretty much overlap, and you add to that all the talk shows. All we do in Israel now is reality shows and news talk, politics talk shows on every possible medium. But there's a very good set of polls that I recommend. It's used to be called the Tammy Steinmetz Center of Tel Aviv University, and now it's run by the Peace Index, exactly. And it's on the internet. Now it's the Israel Democracy Institute. But if you look at the numbers, you see that approximately 60% of the Israeli public support 2 states and a peace process. And I think that the prime minister also supports perhaps not quite the same interpretation. But because you have small unit vetoes within a government, that makes it very difficult, impossible up until now, in order to implement the policies of what I call the general Israeli consensus. There's a consensus, a general Israeli consensus about where the lines should be. They're not the green lines, the 1967 lines, but they're what they're called consensus boundaries or blocks of settlements along the boundary. There's a consensus that everybody should have some burden, some responsibility, whether in the military or through national service. There's a consensus that the huge gap between rich and poor, that all of a sudden Israel has now outranked just about everybody, I think even the United States.
Yeah.
Not as bad as the US, but it's still a 99% situation. There's a consensus that those issues have to be dealt with. And I'm going to end by saying that there is a note of optimism. It's out of character for me to be really optimistic, and I'm not that optimistic. But we now have a political structure, 94 members of 120-member Knesset, that has the opportunity and the leadership. They don't have the excuse anymore of the small minority veto. They can change the electoral system within narrow bounds. You don't want to alienate any of those groups so that they feel completely cut out of the political system. They have an opportunity to deal with each of these issues. It's far too much to expect in 18 months that all of them will be dealt with. But move towards changing the system so that the unit veto problem does not become the source of complete immobility on all these important national issues, to me, is a major opportunity to fix some of the major problems in Israeli democracy today.
Thank you. We'll go down.
Yeah.
Okay, Nurit.
Thank you.
We can turn these
So
off.
I'm gonna, to make this really Israeli, the first thing I'll do is, they say that Israel's got 7.8 million people and about that number of opinions. So I'm gonna respectfully disagree with everything he said. but interestingly, I'll be using the same data, one of the same data sources that you did, which is the Israeli Democracy Index, to make one of my points. So here's what I think. I agree with one thing. I agree that Israel democracy is not going to be demolished tomorrow. The dangers that loom for it are long-term, but we should be looking at them now. We should be recognizing them, identifying them, and doing something to stop them now when they're still in some form of being manageable. And I'll explain what I mean. I think the threats to Israeli democracy are both, we talked before about the top-down, they're both top-down and bottom-up. which means they also do come from the current government and some of the laws they've been passing recently, like the Nakba law and a bunch of other laws that are limiting free speech in Israel. But I won't talk about those because that's not exactly my own field. My field is psychology of identity and the way people, individuals, right, operate in a bigger society. And in terms of bottom up, in terms of grassroots, what people are thinking today about others in Israel, I think things are getting worse and worse. And I'll just point out a few trends, if I may. So the Israel Democracy Index 2011 has been asking all kinds of questions about what Israelis think of others. And this is true of all sectors. In other words, this was also asked of Israeli Arabs. I will focus on the answers given by Israeli Jews. And one of the interesting things we see is that if you break down the answers to these various questions, such as, I'll just give you an example, do you support equal rights for Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, okay? Or would you agree to have an Arab friend? On a completely different area, do you believe that Reform and conservative Jews in Israel should have religious freedom, the right to practice their own, to maybe get some kind of government funding for their synagogues, okay? These kind of questions. If you break down the answers by the religious affiliation or belief of the people who answer it, you get a very, very clear directionality whereby the more religious the people who are answering, the less they're willing to grant any sort of democratic right to others. So, for example, do you consider Israeli Arabs part of Israel? The ultra-Orthodox, only 38% say that they do, right? That means that 62% are saying that Israeli Arab citizens are not, they're not part of Israel. They're not, I'm not talking about the Palestinians here, okay? And there is reason for concern among the secular as well. So if you divide it, right, ultra-Orthodox, national, religious, traditional, Masorti, and the word secular here is the wrong word, but that's the way it's divided there. 78% do consider Arab Israelis part of Israel. That still means that 22% don't. That's a huge percentage. Do you support equal right for Arab Israeli citizens? Only 27% of the ultra-Orthodox support equal rights. And that's down from the previous time this has been asked. And we're still missing 20% of the non-religious population who still think that they do not deserve equal rights. How many people would agree to have an Arab friend? And now I'm grouping the whole population together. 50%, which leaves 50% who are not. Finally, a study of Israeli teenagers in Haifa, which is a mixed city known for its relative tolerance. They asked 809 teenagers in what's called good schools, okay, schools that are not in problem neighborhoods and so on. How do you think of Arabs? And the terms that were used were, for example, 87% thought that Arabs are dirty or like physically, are not clean. Unintelligent was another one that appeared. All of the stereotypes, and they were all negative, were 80% and above. I see cause for concern here. That's one area in which I can identify that. There are others. Today, sometimes you go into, I'll just give one more example. You go into restaurants in Israel, and some of them will have a sign saying, here, only Jewish workers, no enemies work here, funded by Lehava. So now I feel like, where's Mitchell? I hope this is what's considered a supportive audience, that I can share my concerns in that. Yeah, I mean, this is out of love and concern for Israel that I think that this needs to be uprooted now. I have my thoughts about why this is happening and what can be done. I'll leave it at that for now.
That's quite a bundle. Thank you.
Fred? Okay, it's always hard to go after a psychologist. Often someone that's not a political scientist understands more about politics than in Israel than political scientists at times. I find myself in agreement with Gerald. We should almost do more talking, but to begin with, when it comes to the surveys and all of that, I take all the surveys with a grain of salt. And that includes even the surveys before from Mitchell's talk. People are asked a question at a particular time, and that's the answer they give. What it reflects, no one really knows, because the world can change tomorrow by events. And one thing that might make me a little optimistic, much of what you bring out about Israeli attitudes, Jewish attitudes towards Israeli Arabs, if you went back to the 1950s, most Ashkenazi Jews would probably have the same opinions or test the same vis-a-vis Jews from Arab lands. And we've changed, we've intermarried, a lot of things have happened. Now, with Gerald's slide in the beginning, I don't have any problem with that ad. I mean, I don't see it as part of delegitimizing Israel. I don't think it's so shocking, the one that was shown in the United States. I didn't read it very, very closely. I saw it from the side angle. But you know, if you're one of these 300,000 or 400,000 Russian Jews, Russians, that came to Israel under the law of return and thought they were coming to total freedom, and then you have to deal with the Israeli rabbinate, your life is a nightmare. If you're one of the, I don't know if it's tens of thousands, if you're one of the thousands of Israeli soldiers that converted, went to a conversion course sponsored by the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, and then all of a sudden the issue comes up, some rabbis are asking questions, are these legitimate conversions? And all of a sudden you're not going to be Jewish because some rabbis decide, well, again, you talk about a minority, this is scary stuff. And this is stuff, if you see the movie, I remember watching this movie that won the Academy Award about Iran, about religion. That's Israel too today, although we're not Iran, but there are some things that are just very, very uncomfortable once you get to know what's happening in the reality of Israeli life. Now, I'm a product of young Judea. And as a product of young Judea, I remember one time my first sikha, first talk, they called it educational talk in camp, and they explained to us what are the problems of Israel. This is in the 1960s. The problems in Israel, we have two groups of Jews, Ashkenazi European and the Jews that came from Arab lands. So there's a social gap, but what was the major problem? The Jews from Arab lands came out of the Dark Ages. They came from primitive societies. They came from dictatorships and everything else. They don't know what democracy is, okay? You know, and then you start thinking about the fact, well, where did everyone else come from? Where was Ben-Gurion from? They came out of Poland. They came out of the Ukraine. They came out of Russia. This is a tradition of democracy, democratic values, and everything else. No, so one should keep in mind that one of the amazing things about Israel, and this is meant to be very, very positive, that it became a democracy in 1948. A lot had to do with the Yishuv. But one of the problems that older tradition from Eastern Europe brought, and this is Ben-Gurion's contribution, to delegitimize the opposition. And you know, this whole idea about, you know, we don't like critics of Israel, government doesn't like critics, etc., where did it come from? It came from Ben-Gurion vis-a-vis Begin. There was even someone that once wrote an article, I don't know if he got it right or not, that one can even understand the Altalena in the context of wanting to delegitimize Menachem Begin. So he would be traced, wouldn't be accepted, and all of that. And I think that one of the problems today is the need, and this I would disagree with the speaker from the former session. I would quote Burt Gold. Burt Gold was the former president of the American Jewish Committee who talked about the need, we have to open our mouths. We have to let them know, meaning the Israelis, what we really think if some things bother us. Now, to get in specifically and very, very quickly into the issue of freedom, Israeli democracy. And I agree with the previous speaker, or I guess both speakers to some extent. Doesn't seem to be an immediate threat. What is threatened, and she brought this out, are freedoms. For an example, if we were going to have a discussion today about settlements, I can say anything I want now. If I was at Ben-Gurion University, I can't say anything I want. Because if I said certain things, if I decided that I wanted to say, I'm not going to go to teach there, and I don't think that we should let our faculty go there to teach, I could be sued in a court in Israel. Because they passed a law to allow that, to prevent criticism of the settlements in a certain way. So that, you know, that's a denial of freedom. She brought up, and I'm not going to get into the issue of the whole celebration of the Nakba Day. It's like the American Indians want to mourn on July 4th, you know, not in public institutions. and things like that. I mean, that's an indication of where things are changing. But the main issue and the threat to Israeli democracy has to do with, and this is what I tell my students, what's the border of Israel? If the border of Israel is the Jordan River, and this is where I disagree with Gerald, I mean, we all want a two-state solution. The Prime Minister wants a two-state solution, halavai. But if the border of Israel becomes or is or remains the Jordan River, then you're going to have a Jewish minority in the state of Israel in a short period of time. So let's say it's not a Jewish minority. Let's say we're 52, 53, 55%. It still means we're going to have a democratic state with about 30% of the population that really doesn't have rights. And that, to me, is the real threat to Israeli democracy, and it's a ticking time bomb. And one of the problems of Israeli leadership, and this is meant as a criticism, most Israeli leaders, has nothing to do with the Likud. It goes all the way back to Ben-Gurion and Golda and Menachem Begin, all of them. The Palestinian issue is a thorn in our side. It's not an existential threat to the Zionist enterprise. And I think that's a mistake. And that's the threat, in my opinion.
Wow. I must say, I'm tempted to jump in as well. Just a short comment. One of the issues that's been brought up is the issue of time. I think that we could have had, that's time and direction. We could have had this conversation in 1948. In fact, we could have had this conversation any time since the beginning of the Zionist movement. One of the characteristics of the Zionist movement, since before there was a Zionist movement, and certainly at its founding, was that nobody ever had a majority. I think that the greatest plurality ever in the 100 plus year history of the Zionist movement is when Labour had 40 or so % of the votes. Zionism is itself internally fractured, and it had to have been. How do you put together ultra-Orthodox Jews who decided by around 1909 to 1911, I forget the exact date, to splinter from the Zionist movement? The Mizrahi, around 1902, 1904, I forget, but roughly around then, decided they couldn't be regular Zionists, they had to become religious Zionists. Of course, then there were the general Zionists who ran the movement until the labor Zionists took it over. But labor Zionism, of course, is fractured into this kind of socialism, these kind of more communist leading, these kind of more capitalist interest. There was never a time when there was ever a majority in the Zionist movement in itself. Was Martin Buber a Zionist? Of course he was. Did he want a two-state solution? No, he didn't. He wanted really a one-state solution. Was he a Zionist? Of course. So dissent has always been there. And just take that for another moment. It's a personal anecdote, and I suppose it's Fred Lazen who's going to touch off my speaking about it, because I used to run the Ben-Gurion Research Center at Sde Boker. And in 1986, when I was director, I was responsible for the centenary of Ben-Gurion's birth. And some wise guy said, well, gee whiz, why don't we learn from America? Americans, after they've been married for a while, sometimes renew their vows, whether they ought to or not. So why don't we have everybody in Israel sign the Declaration of Independence? It took about a week for us to figure out that that was a non-starter. What was the problem? If you really read seriously the first paragraph of Israel's Declaration of Independence, you find that well, the first paragraph, the first sentence is also problematical. Where was the birthplace of the Jewish people? Actually, someplace near Iraq. But Mela, let's say it was always in Palestine. Okay, we can see, we have an argument. And it was the last part of it, that it was here that they created the Book of Books. My goodness. Why in 1948 could ultra-Orthodox rabbis sign on the Declaration of Independence when the Declaration of Independence actually said, overturned Mount Sinai? We all know that a revelation has informed the way Jews have understood themselves and their history. But to say that the book is the product of the genius or the inspiration of humankind, for 3,000 plus years, Jews haven't believed that. And yet Ben-Gurion, the great villain, signed off on it and read it out, and the head of the Communist Party signed it, Israel's Declaration of Independence, ultra-Orthodox Jews signed it, and all manners, liberals, capitalists, socialists, they all signed on. So what happened? Two things I would say to you. First of all, from the very beginning, the problem of Zionism has been, since 1897 and since 1947, how do you create a tent big enough to comprehend the diversity which is the Jewish people? And from that, then, I come to my question of directionality. And we have to have a sense of perspective. Is it getting worse? That's one question. But even if it isn't, are the nature of the problems becoming different? And do this changing nature of these problems pose, to use your words, Gerald, a greater or a lesser challenge than that faced earlier on in the States? Is the challenge that we now face be from, let's say, Israelis and their views towards Arabs? I would add Arabs and their views towards a Jewish state, and to which I would say the power and place of the ultra-Orthodox community, which theologically is still opposed to the state, but has an ever more powerful role within it. So it's a complex question, is that these camps that now have a place within Israeli society, affirmed by public office, by membership in the Knesset, with an opportunity to inform, how does this tent now work? Is it big enough, commodious enough, to be able to accommodate it all?
Do different orders?
I can do it, whoever speaks first. This is a Quaker meeting. Whoever gets up and speaks in tongues goes first. And if not, I'll have Gerald do it. Fred, go ahead.
Okay, no, you know, we had several questions beforehand, so I thought about them. This isn't one that I thought about, but no, because I think at one time when you talk about the tent and the tent getting larger, when it comes to the Jewish community, I think that Israel has made tremendous strides. I mean, it's a different country vis-a-vis the Jews from Arab lands. Some people use the term the Mizrahim, Eidot HaMizrach. My wife is actually from Baghdad, and as I was telling someone before, when I first met her family in '73, I was again a product of young Judea, where everything in Israel is super, and I show up at this house and they talk about discrimination and racism and the way we were treated, and they took away our dignity. And you look at Israel today, I mean, one of the kingmakers is Mufaz, came to Israel as a 7-year-old kid from Iran. And all of this. I mean, Israel's society has changed, it's integrated, it's opened up, and various groups have found places. But I think that the major problem within the Jewish tent today is really on the issue of religion. It's almost though we've run into a wall with the ultra-Orthodox and even with the national religious community. I think one of the problems of the national religious community, and at least this is my opinion, and I don't want to offend anyone, is Messianism. The Messiah arrived in '67, and that changed reality for a lot of people.
Just like the other secular Messiah arrived in '93 in Oslo.
Okay.
The whole society is Messianic.
Okay, fine. Okay, well, fine. You can speak after I.
Go ahead.
And you can bring that in. And I just don't know how. I don't know how you crack those nuts. I don't know how you deal with that and how compromises can be made, because I think that one of the major threats to the Israeli army today is the whole, you know, all these graduates of Yeshivot Hesder vis-a-vis the issue of women. You know, unless we decide, okay, no, women aren't going to serve anymore, and we're just going to have an army of men, and then we've solved that problem, and that's one way of solving it. But what's happened with Israeli women over the years have been integrated into the Israeli army. Now, one thing which might be surprising to you, when Ilan and I were both at Ben Gurion, I don't know when he came in '81, '82, Shlomo Gazit,
Right.
who became the third president of Israel, president of Ben Gurion University. He came out of military intelligence, and his comment to us one night at his house was, the early '80s, the status of women in the American army is superior to that of the status of women in the Israeli army. That was in the 80s. That's before Iraq and everything else, when you get combat soldiers. Today, we're going backwards. They want to take women out of all these different positions because these religious guys can't have contact. Okay, those are problems we have to deal with. Now, one thing on a positive note. I think that the problem is, or the reality is, of Israel is, and we have to understand this, in that tent there's also a minority of 20% who is not Jewish. You know, some people, when they talk about, you want to call it settler societies, the United States almost committed genocide vis-a-vis something called a group of people called the American Indian. So you can put them on reservations, you don't really have to deal with them. Okay, the same with Australia, the same with New Zealand. In Israel, we have a minority of 20%. They're there, they're citizens, they have rights. And I think that one of the most encouraging things that happened, and I'll just mention this and then finish, was when they had a ceremony with the changing of guard of the Supreme Court. Everyone stands up to sing Hatikva, and the Arab judge didn't stand. He stood, he didn't sing. I apologize. Okay. He didn't sing. And immediately from the Knesset, there are all these calls, you should resign, go to a country where he likes the national anthem a little better, a little less problematic. And Eliakim Rubinstein, who wears a kippah, who was always with Begin, and I'd call him a right-wing judge, whatever that means, he said, why should he sing? He respected us by standing up. How can we as Israeli Jews expect for Israeli Arab citizens to sing Hatikva? And that, for me, was the brightest moment of the year. But those are my values. And that shows that even in this tent with the 20% non-Jewish minority, maybe we can make room for everyone.
Nurit?
I'll
And everybody who clapped can sing the Star Spangled Banner in all its octaves. Yes.
I'll kind of take it from there. Thinking about that tent metaphor, which is a good metaphor. One has to distinguish between plurality and pluralism. Israel has got as much plurality as any country could ever possibly wish for. So the tent in that sense is large just by its nature. It is large, but that still doesn't mean that the walls are strong enough. I don't know, in that sense, a tent is a little problematic. You know, a wind blows it away. So I'm sort of wondering if that's not one of the big differences between the American democracy and the Israeli one. And of course, it's not a fair comparison to make. The American one has been around for so much longer. Its roots are really, they are deeper. And then, of course, one might say to that, well, you know, in Jewish sources, the roots of some elements of democracy do go back 3,000 years, and they can be found. But the problem is not everybody is looking for them. And instead of that, what we're finding is a pretty strong anti-pluralist stance, which seems to be getting stronger because nothing's checking it. Now, to me, that is one of the definitions of extremism. Extremism is the idea, at least in the study of religion, it is the idea of the more the better, right? Let's take it to extremes, right? If you say about somebody that he's religious about something, you mean that he applies it to everything, across board. He's stringent about it in every, and this seems to be, to me, to be in that sense, yes, extremism is growing in Israel, is increasing, or extremists, and the reason is that the walls of the tent aren't strong enough to stop that. Actually, a political scientist, Charles Liebman, who wrote about this idea of extremism, he wrote about it in the field of religion, but he was speaking about Judaism for the most part. And he said, you know, every religion has a pull towards extremism by its nature, by this idea that you're trying to worship God as the one thing that's guiding you, right, and do it the more the better. However, there is something that usually checks religions. Often it comes from within the religion. It doesn't have to be an external force. Moderating forces stop that extremism before it just eats itself up, before it finishes everything inside it, right, burns itself up. And Israel was usually pretty good about that. I think now that balance is being put in danger, okay? Because the extremist forces, and I agree that they are to a large extent religious, and within that to a large extent messianic, but not only, they are getting stronger, and there seem to be less of whatever it is that checks them. The thing that we're absolutely missing now is an insistence on the value of tolerance as an uber value, a value above all the others, tolerance and pluralism for all of the multiple identities within that Israeli tent. Until we have that, our tent is going to be shaky.
Gerald?
Okay, so we do disagree, and we will disagree more because, as the only one on the panel wearing a kippah, in a panel
That's just
which
because I
is
can't wear one.
okay, I accept that. And as in many cases, I'm invited as the token, and people think I'm right wing or I'm part of the religious establishment.
I
and
thought I was a
believe me,
token today.
you're also a token, but in different ways.
Not as much as
Okay, so the bottom line is that it would be good to have somebody here who is more hardline than I am, and I'm going to try to be a little more hardline on these issues. The most intolerant people that I see in Israel, and many people in my neighborhood and the people that I grew up with, are the ultra-secular, militant, there should be no religion. Zionism, to a significant degree, political Zionism, is also a response to the rabbinical Judaism, the dominance of the framework of the rabbinical leadership, not only in Ashkenaz, not only in Europe, but also among the Edot HaMizrach. And what we've had is a secular state that was imposed by a small group of socialist labor Zionists from Eastern Europe that seek to impose and continue to seek to impose their values, their frameworks on a majority population that doesn't buy into that. The polls show that the majority of Israeli Jews, I think it's 90% fast on Yom Kippur, over 50% keep kosher. All of these, and yet you have this constant effort. I see it in many places. It's probably not true anymore. I remember going to Tel Aviv University, and they would always, at Tel Aviv University, they would have in the, there was a greenhouse or something that it was called, they would have their faculty meetings, the faculty meals. And of course, I felt like I was living back in Chutz La'aretz, where I would have to have a little kosher bag, or plastic thing or something, because here in Tel Aviv, at Tel Aviv University, in the faculty club, they didn't even bother. And I think it was lahachis, I think it was deliberate. We are not part of those backward religious Jews. This tension in the society over who's a rabbi, and what is the role of the rabbi, and what is the political role of the rabbi, all of those things we have delayed, we have not been able to work out. Yes, there was a Declaration of Independence, and yes, Ben-Gurion did a chatafi, got away with it, but there was no constitution the next day because they couldn't decide how to deal with exactly those issues. So the intolerance goes both ways and the fear goes both ways, which leads me to be optimistic. And I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. There's another dimension I want to raise in this also, the optimism. You know, it's cautiously optimistic, which is the best that I can afford. When I was younger, in the 70s and the 80s and probably through the 90s, there would be these massive, massive violent demonstrations along the road that comes from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And people got killed. There were rocks that were thrown at drivers on Shabbat, on Kvish Bar Ilan, and they were building the remote road. And there were massive demonstrations outside the court building, the High Court building. They would never accept the authority of the court. This was an attempt to destroy the 3,000, the sacred laws, the books, the halakha, never be accepted. And now, the scale of the violence and the friction on a day-to-day basis is much less. There are points of friction, and it's the way in which certainly the young Haredi leadership battles take place is you go to a place where you can cause a provocation, and then you bring in the anti-Beit Shemesh, so that both poles then are engaged in a conflict, but it's 1% of the Israeli public. 99%, including in the Haredi community, lo sovlim otam.
They don't tolerate.
They don't tolerate them. I can't do this anymore. And I used to tell my students, I used to apologize 30 years ago that my Hebrew wasn't very good, but I thought in Hebrew. Now I say I'm inarticulate in both languages, and it's true. So I think that there is, we're going to be the issue of where we go with the Tal law, the law that was struck down by the courts for good reason, because it allowed the ultra-Orthodox not to be, and also the Arabs not to be involved in military service. That's going to be a very, very difficult fight. I'm cautiously optimistic that it will not be a violent fight, that we can deal with that. So I think on some of these issues, the other point that I was just going to make very quickly was what I call the casual civil rights analogy. That Israelis are racist, have racist views. They don't want to have Arabs working in their neighborhood, and in this restaurant, this is Jewish labor. There's so much trauma. This was much stronger after the failed messianism of Oslo. Both the fact that there was this optimism and the level of violence and the echoing of the terror bombings and the funerals and the hatred that was part of that. And so I don't justify it, but it has not been dealt with properly. This is not the analogy, the casual analogy, that somehow you can compare the civil rights movement of the 1950s to this very, very intense, academic terms, ethno-national conflict between two peoples in a zero-sum game, where every day you can see and hear from the other side that they want to wipe Israel and push the Jews into the sea. Those are very strong images. And how do we deal with those? Usually it's swept under the carpet. Or you're trying to enforce a set of values on people that have no context for those values because their experience is very different. We have to find a way to deal with that in a more tolerant way, a more understanding way, given the difficulties that are there.
Nurit?
Yeah, I'd like to just make a comment on that. If I
There
may.
is no applause in the
We don't get paid extra either for
I'll just give 3 examples of why I see religious extremism on the rise and not on the wane as you suggested. I'm sort of thinking where to begin, but okay. The example that you gave of Bet Shemesh, let's start there. You know, when people would say, you know, look, are you all familiar with
No,
it?
explain what happened to
I'm going to. Okay, so
No,
some
not
do,
everybody
some
does.
do, and some don't. So I'll quickly explain. Two things seem to happen. They're not the same thing. The one is turning into a full-blown demographic battle between the ultra-Orthodox people who are living in parts of Bet Shemesh and the religious Zionists who are living there, with the ultra-Orthodox beginning to sort of terrorize, or perhaps not with quotation marks, and try to push out the more moderate religious forces in that area. And it came to a sort of a fore with the story of the little 8-year-old Naama Margolis, right? I'm sure a lot of you have seen pictures or read of her, who was shown on film, you know, crying to her mother, please don't make me walk to school again. Those Haredi bullies spit at me, yell at me, and so forth. She was wearing, you know, above, over the elbow sleeves and a long skirt, and they were calling her, you know, immodestly dressed in very rude terms, an 8-year-old. So that was one thing, and that's another example, I think, of intolerance. But another example, which is actually happening in that same area, is an internal turning to extreme of the ultra-Orthodox. And I think it raises a huge question of, really, of what does tolerance mean in a democratic society? How does it work? Because what's been happening there is it began as a small group of women who took upon themselves to cover themselves beyond the regular modesty adherence code, which is pretty serious anyway. So in kind of colloquial terms, they're called the Taliban women, because they cover themselves with what's pretty much the equivalent of a burqa, except some of them don't even have kind of a mesh where the eyes are. They look down. They walk looking down. I just want to tell you an interesting figure that I recently read. 20,000 of these burqas have now been sold in Israel. So we're not talking like some people want to present it, 100-woman, crazy woman. The ultra-Orthodox, and I'm glad they're doing this, are portraying it as a very, very, very minor phenomenon. That's fine, because that'll be a good way to control it. But it's not that minor. Right now, the estimate is that 10,000 women are not only in Bet Shemesh anymore. There's a big group in Jerusalem who are covering themselves entirely. Just recently, some photos have been taken of 6-year-old girls who are being covered to the feet with black shawls.
Arab women.
Jewish.
There'll be a chance, I promise everybody, there'll be a chance for questions, not answers.
That's a good
later
direction
on.
to think of it.
Right now, this is our time.
So just a couple of other data along those lines. And these are things that did not exist before. So in that sense, that's what I call extremism. It's
Spreading out.
Spreading out, exactly. Medical care is being not given to some girls because they're girls. I just read of a Haredi Avrecha, Haredi, so yeshiva bocher, right, who's only allowed to come home after his girl daughters have gone to sleep so he doesn't see them awake. You know, so now here. So this can sound scary.
Be careful from urban legends.
Yeah, they're not
versus
urban
more-
legends.
Some
though.
of these are.
Here, okay, so, no, well, what they are, they're absolutely a minority. I agree with you there. But you know what? Minorities can spread. This is where, if we recognize extremism for what it is, we should be finding ways to deal with it.
Well, now it's my turn.
I agree.
I agree, too, with everything that has been said, but I want to suggest another way to look at it. And that other way to look at it is, first of all, the Haredi community. We talk about it as the Haredi community.
It's multiple.
It is a very fragmented community. You know, one Hasidic court does it its way, and another Hasidic court, let alone the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox. You know, one wouldn't imagine a Litvak rabbi coming to ask for a blessing from Saadia, Ovadia rather. It just doesn't work that way. In short, that's a very fragmented world. And that within the Haredi world, there are now people going to college. There's a women's college for Haredi women that you may talk about the burqas. But heavens knows that there are a lot of Haredi women who are learning how to go out and make a living. There's a school in Jerusalem called Ma'aleh, where Haredi women are making movies.
As religious Zionists.
But that's important.
There are
There's a whole literature being created in Hebrew by Haredi women, which describes their world, their problems. It's difficult to get a fix on what's taking place because the arrows go in many different ways. I'd like to offer, I'm not a political scientist, but let me offer a political science suggestion, is that there are mechanisms for self-control within Israeli, self-correction within Israeli society. In the 1990s, when, as a result of the exuberance and the hubris of the ultra-Orthodox communities believing that the future was in their hands, and expression after expression, public expressions, that they would somehow dictate the future of Israeli society, a whole political party arose by Walter Lapid, but Tommy Lapid, that got 15 mandates, which is the equivalent to the total amount of mandates that the ultra-Orthodox parties have. Today, there are 16 mandates in Lieberman's party, which is hardly a friend of ultra-Orthodoxy. This is the Russian party, which is, again, equal to the amount of mandates or votes, Knesset members, that the ultra-Orthodox party has. In short, I'll go on with that. One of the fears that people have of ultra-Orthodoxy is exaggerated. The ultra-Orthodox are not in the most important centers of power in Israel by their own decision and how they interpret themselves. They are not in the army. They are not in the high command. They do not, I've yet to see an ultra-Orthodox chief of staff. They are not running Silicon Valley. They are not yet running the banks. They have illegal banks. But that's a whole, that gray economy. But in short, the centers of finance and the military of real power in Israeli society. And the powers of countering their kind of influence are extraordinarily large. And that one could make algorithmic extrapolations that look at the rate of growth within the Haredi community and extrapolate from these kinds of sensational events and see a future which is entirely black. That is one perspective that suggests that within the structure and within the dynamics of Israeli society, that there are mechanisms for dealing with these excessive, sensational, troublesome, intolerant phenomenon, which in fact are dangers for democracy. But Israel itself has a kind of system which can, and has at least in the past, coped with it. Fred?
Okay, I agree with most of the words you've said, but I have the opposite conclusion. I think that the whole issue is out of hand. Now, I don't have a problem if some woman wants to dress and cover herself from head to toe. That's her. I don't have a problem with that. But the fact is, the Haredi community today is, they don't have political power. They're not in the army and all that. They make up 9% of the population. If I get my figures correct, and Gerald can correct me, they make up 25% of the elementary Jewish school pupils in the country, which means 1 out of 4. They have a welfare system which covers them from the cradle to the grave. They have the highest birth rate in the country, and they're going to continue to grow, be fruitful and multiply, and fill up. The country's going to go bankrupt. And what happens? The Tal law failed, but the Tal law had 2 parts to it. One part was the army, the other part was to get people into the workforce. The ultra-Orthodox parties objected, nothing happened. It was a total failure, it just didn't work. What's going to happen now, the comment in the Yediot Ahronoth from Friday was the comment, Mufaz wants to be prime minister. So anyone expecting that the current government is really going to do something about the ultra-Orthodox and the army and the workforce, hope.
You see, we're all dealing with scholars who deal with data from the present. I happen to deal with data from the past, but all of us are making projections about the future. And that's really the nature of Israel studies. Everybody wants to know, well, what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's the ultimate Jewish.
That's the what's will sein? What's going to take place here? And we don't know. I'm far less pessimistic than you, Fred. I just don't believe that since it cannot sustain itself, since you and I know it's a logical impossibility that the 80% of Israeli society who actually work for a living are going to support a growing population, that something else is going to happen. And that something else that's going to happen is change within that community. And there are signs of change in many different places. To extrapolate that insanity will take root when there are a lot of other people in society who have a stake in living a real life in that society, that they're going to allow that to happen. The only question is really, what's the cost? And does the system within itself have a kind of mechanism which can mitigate inevitable frictions? And I think ultimately what's necessary in those kinds of circumstances is something that American political scientists know very well, is that very few of us live a one-dimensional life, that we may belong to one national group, have one religion, belong to one economic order, and to expect that Israelis, even Haredi and even secular Jews, are really one-dimensional people and do not have the capacity to find the means to live together is, maybe it's wishful thinking, is an act that doesn't favor the kind of generosity which I think real life demands. Having said that, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, I have an observation. You want to go to the question?
No. Your observation.
Two
Go ahead.
observations. I have a small but growing shelf of books that are about the coming crisis in Israel. Will Israel exist in 1985 or something like that? Peter Beinart's my latest addition to that. That's always been, since the creation of the state, there has been that angst, that sense that it's going to fall apart. We're almost there. We can't deal with these problems. Some of it is security, some of it is internal. So yes, this is what's going to be question that's out there, and a tendency, historical tendency to say that my values, my view is being threatened, and therefore the country's going to fall apart. And that brings me to the other observation, which I started with, and that's sort of, I'm looking at the audience here, and it's what gets me concerned a lot. What's happened, it's always been that way, but I think even more so with the age of instant communications and Twitter and everything else, social media, that there's an attempt now, and it's quite successful, to mobilize, enlist, both of those terms, the diaspora community. When Israel is in, and we can all take these conflicts with a grain of salt, they get exported, and then the diaspora community, whether it's on settlements versus peace, as if it was a completely bifurcated choice, whether it's on the issue of women in Israeli society, whether it's the threat to Israeli democracy that gets quite popular and gets people very involved. So you have Beinart, and you have all these at the 92nd Street Y and all these other places having debates about whether Israel's democracy is endangered. And people have very strong opinions, I find, in the non-Israeli Jewish diaspora community without understanding these complexities or the fact that, in fact, they're being drafted in, pulled in to a conflict which does not, the 60% of the population doesn't feel is that critical. So they come and they become, they in certain sense exacerbate that conflict. That's part of it also, is a reflection of the bifurcation of American politics.
I had 6 other questions, but we're not going to go to your questions. I would only observe that your bookshelf should actually be a bookcase. I'd like to see one shelf that to pick up a phrase invented by Rabinovich, the literature that was created about the ever-dying Jew. I mean, we were always, I mean, the discussion in the last 200 years of the disappearance of the Jews, and I'd like a special section which I'd like to put as many issues as I can. Something I remember growing up here, which was a Look magazine. Remember Look magazine? Life we remember, but there's also a magazine called Look. And there was a cover in the mid-1950s of a buffalo. And the headline was, will the American Jew vanish like the buffalo? You know, so there's the ever-dying Jew, there's the ever-vanishing Jew, and there's now the state of Israel that will not. But however, these are real questions. If we didn't ask the questions that Rabinovich could poke fun of, and Look magazine poked fun of, we wouldn't have a whole host of institutions, educational institutions and research, in order to ensure that that which we don't want to happen will in fact not take place. And the very nature of the kind of discourse, however we come up on the different sides of this question, how we interpret, suggests how significant and even painful, or at least poignant, this issue is, and why it really demands the best of our mental energies and our political sensibilities to make sure that the unspeakable, in fact, never does take place. There were questions, and the first, would you come to the microphone?
I was just curious to know the large number of American Jewish immigrants to Israel, the ones that move to the settlements and take up arms. Is that growing, or is it slowing down? Does it present a real problem as far as the Israeli government is concerned?
There's a student who's doing a dissertation on that as part of the Schusterman program. I think she's here.
Mitchell Bard can speak to it. I think the question is really Sarah Hirschland's dissertation about American Jews who come to the settlements. First of all, most, you know, when the media go out to the settlements and they interview people, they like to get people who can speak English. So the perception that somehow the settlements have become the Ellis Island of American Jewry in the Middle East is grossly exaggerated. There are a lot of Israelis, there are a lot of there are more people there who are secular than there are religious. There are a lot of Russians there who are not Haredim. The motivations for going there are very, very diverse, which is probably very encouraging, because if for no other reason, it suggests that when our coveted two-state solution comes to force, and in fact, some of the settlements, you can figure out how many some is, are in fact uprooted, that a lot of people will go, will pick up and leave. That's what the indexes also say, because not everybody on the West Bank believes that the Messiah is imminent, and what's more, he's going to land in their settlement.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, but the only thing, there are a percentage of the ideological, what we call ideological settlers, are probably what we call Anglo-Saxon from Western countries, whether it's 5%, 10%, something like that. But a lot of the settlers, by the way, in some of these settlements around Jerusalem are ultra-Orthodox, Haredim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. But I want you to know that there are some former Anglo-Saxons who live in places like Beersheba, like Jerusalem, like Tel Aviv, like Ramat Gan, like Ramat HaSharon, that not all of us went to the
And
settlements.
by the way, after 20 years, your kids are no longer immigrants or Anglo-Saxons, they're Israelis, and that's a whole different ballgame.
That's right. Yes.
You want to get this side?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, I have a question directed to the political scientist, Gerald Steinberg. It's about this coalition government, both future and past. Obviously, we're all interested in your opinion about what changes will take place, in addition to the Tal law, to marginalize some of the marginal parties. I mean, I thought that was one of the major points of this, and give the smaller parties less power, and in fact, change the laws to further marginalize them. But the other question, looking backwards, is what happened with the last election when President Perez asked Netanyahu and Likud to form a government? And there was lots of discussion about a national government, tippy-lippy. What happened? Why did not that happen? Were her demands too great at the time that Netanyahu would not accept? Were they unreasonable demands? And what's her future, if any?
I'm going to ask the questions. Thank you very much. That's an important question, and I regret that Tzipi Livni, who's one of my heroines, was not in the government. But I'd like short questions, and I'd like
We have to take
imagine
notes and then
answers,
answer them.
because we have 12 minutes for the 8 people, which means we're going to be here till after my shuttle leaves. Go ahead.
I'll do it real quick then. First of all, I don't like the term political scientist. There's no science in this really, but anyway. It's politics. We can do politics. I'll start from the back and see if I can remember that. Tzipi Livni, her future is probably zero in politics, very unlikely, because she definitely didn't do anything as head of the largest part of the opposition. There are different versions as to why she wasn't included in the government, but I think the simplest one is that she couldn't accept the fact that she could not form a government. Largest party didn't win the election. Netanyahu was able to form a government, and she wouldn't accept his terms. She wanted either a rotating prime ministership or something. I blame, and many Israelis blame her for not making the steps that were necessary, because Netanyahu did have the ability to form a government. I think, and the more important question is, there are a lot of ideas out there. Whether, in fact, in any political system, they will actually be implemented. If they don't, there's going to be a big price to pay. Why did you bother with this whole 94-person government if you're not implementing something serious? But I can see things like increasing the minimum number of votes in order to have seats so you don't have such tiny parties. Perhaps some sort of an electoral process where the government, the party with the largest number of seats, that person will become prime minister, and they can only be brought down by a vote of something like 75 versus 61. Greater stability and less of a possibility of blackmail by very small marginal parties. There are downsides to all of those ideas, and when they start getting into the nitty-gritty, I suspect we're going to find out that it's going to be much harder. But again, if they leave office in 18 months or less without having done something, that will cost Netanyahu dearly, and Mofaz will not be a political figure after that, I would guess.
I think we'll go that, and we'll go back and forth, ping pong.
That's a very quick question. Professor Leeson reminded us of that incident where the Israeli Arab Supreme Court justice refused to sing Hatikva. That makes me want to ask the panel psychologists in particular, how is the perception of Israel's Arabs, their self-perception, how is it changing?
Yeah, it's changing. It's a big topic and way too big for the minute that I have. You could look on the internet, on the Israel Democracy Index, you'll find some of their own perceptions. Basically, it's a very divided identity, very confused, and there are different ways of solving it. Different groups have been solving it, so to speak, differently. But bottom line, they're really, really looking for their own place in Israeli society. They basically, many of them do feel a basic loyalty as citizens. Of course, they have a big problem with the issue of not being Jewish and, living in Israel, and would prefer Israel to be the country of all its citizens. But how they define themselves about divides equally between those who call themselves Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Israeli Arabs, and various other permutations of those. So there's not one simple answer to that. It's hard to be Jewish in Israel. Believe me, it's harder right now to be an Arab in Israel.
Yes.
I just want to refer to the idea of the seclusion of women. I find it as some kind of extension of what happened in 2009. Some left-wing organizations, usually coordinated by the New Israel Fund, decided that Israel is going to fascism, and many organizations called Solidarity Against the Fascism were created. People think that they are going to jail journalists, jail Arab who marked the Nakba, and 3 years passed and nothing happened. No journalist was ever jailed. No Arab was ever stopped for all the Nakba festivals they are doing every year. Nothing happened. So they just moved to the next step. Let's talk about seclusion of women. And the whole story started with some religious guys went out when women start singing. So no even basic right of any woman was violated, because there are many rights of speech. I don't know any human right that no man will get out of the room when the woman sings, and I guess she's not Maria Callas anyhow. And just to conclude, because I have to be short, it's even funnier when I look at it now from America, that the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, is expressed deep concern about the seclusion of women, that some guys left from the room, and then she probably was not much concerned about some things that happen in the Oval Room here and there. And of course, it's when people said it. No, but when people said it, of course it's ad hominem. But Hillary Clinton made a joke out of herself, and all of Israel was laughing at her for 2 weeks, and then people were not aware of it because they're reading Haaretz, and all the people that 3 years ago talk about Israel going to fascism, then all day long talk about terrible condition of women in Israel, and they don't understand it's all orchestrated by the same organization and no base.
Look, I don't use the word fascist. I think you're whitewashing the situation. It's not as though Israel's either a fascist state or it's not a fascist state. No one's saying Israel's a fascist state. We're just talking about the treatment of women. There are hundreds of bus lines in Israel today where women have to go to the back of the bus.
They don't have to, Fred. They don't have to. The Supreme Court was very clear about that.
Many of these bus lines are public bus lines.
No, Fred, the law is very, very clear. The Supreme Court...
I don't have support.
Well, we have, Mitchell is no longer in the room, but we have a topic for another session.
Two or three, really.
But it's all part of that same.
But it's all part of this. It is all part of the same issue. There is law, and there is practice, and there are perceptions. Actually, it's quite a blessing to have a psychologist with us to keep us rooted in what people believe. But what we would need to have to balance, if we needed to balance a psychologist, to have a theologian, because we're dealing not only with realities, but how people perceive them. Another question.
Yes,
and then we're going to end in 10 minutes. So let's keep
moving back.
Maybe collect all the questions.
Why don't?
My question is for the psychologist, for Nurit. So, all of you actually spoke about all of these problems as very specifically Israeli, whether it was the issue of the splintering of the Knesset because of small parties, or Begin being dismissed by by Ben-Gurion, causing the delegitimization of the opposition. But all of these things, to me, as someone brought up here, sound very familiar, all of them. I mean, we constantly terribly delegitimize the opposition. We do it at least as badly as Israelis do, and we don't have the Ben-Gurion history. So my question is it really as specific and Israeli, of these issues as specifically Israeli as you presented them? In particular, for example, Nuri talked about the poll results about attitudes towards Arabs. Would you want an Arab as a friend? And the numbers. The numbers are much smaller than the numbers I would remember as a kid coming from our South vis-a-vis American blacks. Now, all I'm saying is, and it changed in one generation. You're talking about the danger long range. If I, when I was 15, said that about America, I would have thought we're hopeless, you know, but it changed in one generation. Don't you think that much of this is actually universal and will change the same way there?
Okay. Next question.
All right.
No answer.
Well, yes.
Yeah, okay. First thing is...
No, only one thing. Go first.
One half of the first thing. When she's talking about the Haredi, what happened to Beit Shemesh, she should have balanced it, mentioning that there were many Haredis who joined with that little 8-year-old girl to take her to school because they felt that the hooligans of that other group of Haredis. So I think you got to balance that out. That's part of the other half of the question, dealing with the tent. We're talking about a big tent. We're talking about a big tent in Israel of all sorts of denominations. We're talking about Ashkenazi, we're talking Sephardic, you're talking about Jews have come from all over, their children and melded in there. The question I have is, how do you handle when you're talking about a tent which includes non-Jewish Israelis like Arabs, which have a totally different theology, as we see it throughout every country in the Middle East. We see a total breakup, a lot of infighting between the various denominations. How do you know that's not going to happen if you want to include that group within this big tent of what Israel is? I think you're asking for a lot of trouble.
Thank you. Next question.
I don't know if the entire panel can comment, but there were some suggestions here that the U.S. Jews try to have some coherent approach vis-a-vis the outside world, nuancing it by the audiences they talk to. But there are contradictions here. Israeli entities seek financial support from American Jews. With that financial support, naturally comes an input into what happens. And I feel that J Street has every right to lobby Congress. It may have different positions from AIPAC, but there need to be different voices heard. So I'm curious about your feeling about American Jewish pluralism vis-a-vis American decision makers.
I have a feeling that's directed towards me. Right?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, quickly, about Sion and the nature of the covenant.
No, we're taking the questions. We don't have enough time to do all of the answers. So, well, it's important for us to hear what excites the mind of the people here. And everybody else. And so let's hear the questions.
This will be exciting.
And we'll deal with the time that we have.
It relates to Sion and the nature of the covenant. There was an Israeli movie presented here called My Bull, The Flood, about autism in Israel, the lack of sympathy, compassion. I asked the director, what's the prevalence of autism in Israel? There is no data. These children are closeted in the Orthodox community. The reason I bring this up is because the prevalence of autism in societies or religions that don't circumcise their children, the Old Order Amish, are very low, and those that do have infant circumcision, Somalis and Sweden, are very high. So the question is, what's the nature? If circumcision is a risk factor for autism, what does that mean for Jewish identity and Haredis? And the nature of the covenant. What are we talking about? Is this a literal covenant or a spiritual covenant?
Okay. I don't want to circumscribe anybody's right to speak.
It's just take it off.
My question is probably really off the wall, but everybody talks about democracy as, well, let's fix the democracy and figure out what we could do. I might point out our founders here were really bothered about having democracy because they knew that people could start voting themselves benefits from the treasury, and that democracies only last for about 200 years, and we've been kind of lucky. We've been a little over 200 years, and we've got these huge debts. and people are voting themselves benefits from the Treasury. Israel does that too, and as a Reform Jew, I'd love to see conservative and Reform get money in Israel, but what I'd rather see is that the money get taken away from any of the religions and let the religions work that way. And by the way, one more thing about Israel, they call it the startup nation. But a lot of this has happened since Netanyahu was finance minister and opened up the economy, and so that Israel has been able to have a market economy, and that markets will help a lot of the problems that you folks are dealing with, not everything. But if you stop subsidizing the religious in Israel, if you stop subsidizing a lot of other people instead of asking for, well, if you're subsidizing these people, subsidize the others. But I'd like to see something about, someone talk about markets and not get hung up in democracy, because democracy doesn't work all that well in the long run.
It's the best we have.
One last question, observation, short speech.
This is a pretty simple one. Nurit, when you first spoke, you mentioned that peace, whatever the survey you were talking about, you mentioned that Reform and conservative Jews were surveyed on religious freedom, but then you never spoke to that point. So I'm just curious as to what the responses were from that segment.
Okay. I need instructions. How much time have we got?
No, I'm tired. Let's go home.
We have 5 minutes.
Why?
Why don't each one of you?
No.
No. Why don't each one of you then take a point to which you would like to speak?
Yeah.
And I'll wrap up.
I'd like to make 3 quick points just to the questions. One, Netanyahu was a great economics minister, Minister of Finance under Sharon, but it was Shimon Peres in the 1980s that turned Israel into a capitalist economy. He said if you want to live like a socialist, you have to work like a capitalist, which he understood. Second, on autism, I had a PhD student who had 2 autistic twins. He got much better care in the state of Israel in a town north of Beersheba than he got in the state of Pennsylvania. And in terms of J Street, in my own opinion, I think that the Israeli government makes a mistake by not treating J Street better. That's all.
I'll make one comment, I think, and just try to kind of. So, you know, it's easy to get into these apocalypse scenarios, and I don't want to be there. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, I think apocalypse scenarios are dangerous because they're detracting us from the real question. The real question is not, will Israel survive? Will the Haredim overtake? And I study Haredim. I don't think that they're the danger to Israel. Right. But the question is, what will be the face of Israel? Israel will exist, God willing, you know. What will it look like? It doesn't necessarily have to look as good as we'd want it to, but that's our job, to fight for it. You know, somebody here was mentioning the situation of the African Americans. People fought for those rights. The fact that it changed from the 1960s was largely due to people like Martin Luther King, who even gave up their lives in order for that to happen. It doesn't happen if you just sit back and say, don't worry, you know, we're going to find those corrective ways to. Yes, probably we're not going to, you know, it's not going to end up in a big bang or something, but I hope. But we have to fight for that, and that's what my purpose in this is, to think of it that way. About the conservative Jews and all of that, I'll be happy to talk to you later. I am a conservative Jew, and in Israel, we have a lot of work to do on that front as well.
Okay, that's actually a good note for me to just say a general point about debate being a good thing. In the Jewish tradition, is a machloket is a good thing. A debate, l'shem shamayim, that the purpose of this is not just to make Israel a better place, because I don't need to come to Washington to do that, but to make the Jewish diaspora relationship, the Jewish people relationship better. We have to have these kinds of debates. I think, frankly, first of all, I don't want to judge myself, but I enjoyed this panel. And I got a sense that a lot of people were involved. Those people who put this together, Laura and Mitch, these are the kinds of discussions that we need to have in many, many different communities, where we have different points of view, and no view is being excluded out because you can't. It's the political correctness, which to me is the biggest danger of democracy, and it's in Israel, and it's in the American campuses, and it's in many other places, and let's have more of these. Shkoyach.
Yeah, I want to thank the organizers as well for conceiving of this, and I too like the argumentation about it, and it's good to argue. And it's for the sake of heaven, and it's also for the sake of those who are still on this earth. And I suppose the observation that I would suggest to you is an observation, a metaphor, two of them. One is that there's an illusion that particularly not only American Jews, but all Jews in this 20th century have about what's taking place in Israel. We somehow assume that a placid, easily comprehensible, functioning society ought to take place. You know, after all, with Jewish sensitivities and brilliance and capacities, how could it be otherwise? But I'm reminded of something my good friend Shlomo Avineri once said. You know, the Jews haven't been living together for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years. And here we come together, and we come from many different cultures, political cultures, religious cultures, you name it, with different languages. And it's not an easy process. The very fact that we come together and do strive with one another within a sense of belonging together. And also that many of us have a sense that whatever solution it is that we arrive at has to be broad enough to embrace those who are not Jews, because we're not just creating a Jewish state, but we're trying to create a Jewish and democratic state, really compounds the problems far and away beyond anything that existed in America 200 years ago, when 90% of the white people in this country were Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So it's a challenge. And my metaphor, and I'll just share it with you, is a metaphor that I guess all of us in our family have, and it comes from the image of Hasneh HaBoer. Remember the burning bush? What was the miracle? That it was not consumed. To live in Israel and to be part of Israeli discourse, let alone part of the Israeli Academy, is to engage in the study of subject matter that is so intense, if not incendiary, that it is beyond the norms of what most of my colleagues have to deal with. And to actually live in that place and to make a life in that place that's sane and corresponds with our values, taking into consideration the values of other people, is to reenact the image of the burning bush, is to live in a very intense place and to not be consumed by it. So it's been fun to be part of this panel. We have a lot of work to do.
I want to thank all of you who are here today. I think you got a sense of the complexity with which our scholars look at Israeli society. It's a richness that we are trying to bring to American University on a regular basis, and it's a richness that AICE is bringing to dozens of universities in the United States, many of which is done with outside funding, which we all struggle with. So I want to thank everyone who's here today. If you appreciate this, to support those organizations that are doing this work, because I think it's important and it enriches the universities in which these professors are resident.